Ferdinand Waldo Demara was born in the United States in 1921. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He was polite, soft-spoken, and well-mannered. People who met him later often said the same thing: he sounded educated, he acted professional, and he never seemed nervous. Demara did not look like a liar. He looked like someone who belonged wherever he stood. From an early age, Demara wanted status. Not wealth, not fame, but authority. He wanted titles that made people listen. Doctor, officer, specialist. He was intelligent and had an excellent memory, but he lacked patience. Long years of study felt unnecessary to him. In his mind, learning slowly was inefficient when the result could be reached faster another way. While moving between schools and institutions in the 1940s, Demara made an important observation. Most organizations rely more on confidence than verification. If a person speaks clearly, uses professional language, and presents clean paperwork, questions are rarely asked. Demara understood that credentials often function as symbols, not proof. He began forging documents. Diplomas, recommendation letters, service records. He did not exaggerate his abilities. Instead, he carefully chose roles that allowed him to learn on the job. He watched others closely, copied their behavior, and filled gaps in knowledge by reading obsessively. When pressure increased or suspicion appeared, he moved on before anyone could investigate deeply. Over several years, Demara assumed multiple identities. He worked as a monk, a psychology assistant, a prison supervisor, and a teacher. In each role, he relied on the same method: blend in, sound certain, and avoid unnecessary attention. Remarkably, this approach worked. He was rarely challenged, and when he was, he simply disappeared and started again somewhere else. The most dangerous decision of his life came in the early 1950s. Demara crossed into Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Navy using the name Dr. Joseph Cyr. He claimed to be a trained surgeon and presented forged medical credentials. At the time, background checks were limited, and the Navy urgently needed medical personnel. His documents were accepted without serious review. Demara was assigned as a ship's doctor. Unlike his previous roles, this position allowed no margin for error. Mistakes would not result in embarrassment or dismissal. They would result in real deaths. Demara understood this immediately. He had no medical degree, no formal training, and no surgical experience. What he did have was confidence, discipline, and an intense ability to study under pressure. He began reading medical textbooks constantly. Anatomy, surgical procedures, emergency treatment. He memorized diagrams, studied terminology, and relied on logic rather than training. Whenever possible, he delayed difficult cases and avoided complex procedures. For a while, the illusion held. Then the ship was sent to Korea. In 1951, the Canadian naval ship where Demara served was deployed to support United Nations forces during the Korean War. The environment changed instantly. This was no longer routine medical work aboard a quiet vessel. Wounded soldiers began arriving in serious condition, many of them requiring immediate surgical intervention. Evacuation was not always possible. Waiting was not an option. Demara was now the only surgeon available. Officially, he was a fully qualified medical officer. Unofficially, he had never performed surgery on a living person. There was no supervision, no second opinion, and no safe way to step aside without exposing himself. If he refused to act, soldiers would die. If he acted and failed, the outcome would be the same. He chose to operate. Before each procedure, Demara locked himself in the ship's medical library. He studied surgical manuals in detail, focusing on step-by-step instructions. He memorized diagrams, reviewed anatomy charts, and rehearsed procedures mentally. His approach was methodical. He avoided improvisation whenever possible and followed written instructions exactly. Over the course of several months, Demara performed multiple operations, including complex battlefield surgeries. One of the most documented cases involved wounded Korean soldiers who had suffered severe chest injuries. Demara carried out thoracic procedures that normally required years of surgical training. Against all expectations, the patients survived. Nurses later reported that Demara remained calm during operations. He gave clear instructions, worked slowly, and never showed panic. His confidence reassured the medical staff, who had no reason to doubt his qualifications. The crew trusted him completely. In total, Demara successfully treated and operated on numerous wounded soldiers during this deployment. No patients died as a direct result of his surgical actions. From the outside, his performance appeared not just competent, but exceptional. Ironically, his success made exposure more likely. Medical officers higher up the chain of command began to notice his work. Reports praised his effectiveness. Questions were raised about his background, not because of failure, but because of how well he seemed to perform under pressure. His name circulated beyond the ship. The illusion began to crack when a fellow doctor, familiar with the real Joseph Sear, recognized inconsistencies in Demara's history. A quiet investigation followed. When naval authorities began checking records more carefully, the forged credentials unraveled quickly. Demara was confronted. Instead of punishment or arrest, the response was unexpected. The Canadian Navy quietly discharged him. No public charges were filed. The incident was classified as an embarrassment rather than a crime. Publicly exposing the case would raise uncomfortable questions about military oversight during wartime. Demara returned to civilian life, alive, undiscovered by the public, and carrying a secret that few could believe. The most dangerous chapter of his life was over. But the story was far from finished. After his quiet discharge from the Canadian Navy, Ferdinand Demara returned to the United States. For a time, he lived anonymously. There were no charges, no public statements, and no official record explaining what had happened. To the outside world, his military service simply ended. The Navy chose silence, and Demara benefited from it. That silence did not last. In the mid-1950s, journalists began uncovering fragments of his past. Former colleagues spoke off the record. Military sources confirmed unusual details. Eventually, the full story surfaced. A man with no medical degree had served as a wartime surgeon and successfully operated on wounded soldiers. Newspapers quickly labeled him the Great Impostor. The public reaction was conflicted. Some viewed Demara as a dangerous fraud who should have been imprisoned. Others saw him as a strange kind of hero. He had not harmed his patients. In fact, he had saved lives under extreme conditions. The question became uncomfortable: if the outcome was success, how much did credentials matter? Demara did not hide from the attention. He gave interviews, calmly explaining his actions without apology or pride. He admitted forging documents and assuming false identities, but insisted that he never intended to hurt anyone. According to him, his motivation was simple. He wanted to belong somewhere, to be respected, and to do meaningful work. Over the following years, Demara continued to drift between roles. He worked as a counselor, a hospital orderly, and later as a minister. This time, however, he remained within positions that did not require falsified credentials. The exposure had ended his ability to disappear completely. Psychologists later analyzed his behavior. Some described him as a pathological imposter. Others suggested he was driven by an intense need for acceptance and authority rather than deception itself. There was no clear diagnosis, only speculation. What disturbed many professionals was not Demara himself, but the systems he exploited. His story revealed how easily institutions could be fooled by confidence, paperwork, and assumptions. Background checks failed. Oversight failed. The illusion worked because no one expected it to fail. Demara lived the rest of his life quietly. He never returned to medicine, never attempted another large-scale impersonation, and never faced legal consequences for his most dangerous actions. He died in 1982. His case remains unique. Not because he lied, but because, despite having no right to succeed, he did.